The Turning Point of My Life. An essay by Mark Twain. The bazaar has thrown down the gauntlet, asking us to ponder the sacred notion of turning points in life. So, here I am, dutifully scribbling my musings, though I must say, the whole idea is wildly overrated. You see, people love to dramatize that one life-changing moment, as if a celestial drumroll accompanied it. But let's be honest, that so-called turning point is just the last domino in a long, clumsy line of other dominoes that have been toppling since birth. Imagine looking at your life like a long, glorious train ride, and suddenly declaring, "This stop right here. This one is the reason I arrived." Conveniently ignoring that the train's been chugging along for ages, with plenty of crucial stops before this grand, Instagram-worthy moment. I mean, sure, we could all nod sagely and say, this event changed everything, but really, we're just giving that one moment a gold medal while the other 9,999 moments sit quietly in the corner, wondering why they weren't invited to the awards ceremony. Now, if you want to talk about properly overblown turning points, let's bring in the big leagues, Julius Caesar and that melodramatic stroll across the Rubicon. Picture it, he stands at the river, stares dramatically at the water, and sighs, "Well, lads, we could turn back, but nah, let's just go ahead and rewrite history." Oh, the suspense. The tension. But let's be real, every poor decision, battle, haircut, and questionable toga purchase that came before this moment also led him there. That river wasn't the mastermind of his fate, it was just the final nudge. Yet, because we humans love a good story, we zoom in on that one step and blow it up to planetary proportions. The moment Caesar changed the world. We proclaim, conveniently ignoring the thousands of smaller steps, stumbles, and bad lunches that paved the way to this point. If life were a movie, the dramatic music would start here, but it really should have started long before, maybe back when Caesar first realized politics was more fun than farming. So, let's all take a breath and stop throwing confetti at these so-called turning points. They're just the final puzzle piece in a jigsaw that's been assembling itself for years. And if we're being honest, most of our life-changing moments probably just felt like a Tuesday at the time. And now, dear reader, we arrive at the real juicy part of history, the moment when Caesar, our toga-clad protagonist, pauses dramatically at the Rubicon, rubbing his chin like a man deciding whether to invade Rome or just order another glass of wine. Your fate, my fate, and that of the entire human race supposedly teeters on this one decision. No pressure, Jules. But wait, just when the tension reaches a delicious boiling point, in strolls a complete rando. Not a senator, not a general, not even a particularly insightful goat, just some dude with excellent posture, a dreamy aesthetic, and a flute. Because apparently, history isn't written by the victors, it's written by that one guy in the background with an unexpected musical interlude. So, picture the scene, soldiers and shepherds alike, enchanted by this mysterious musical influencer, gather round. And then, in an Oscar-worthy moment, our nameless bard drops the flute, snatches a trumpet, and blasts out the most epic "Let's Go" in human history. Caesar, ever the fan of a dramatic entrance, takes this as his sign from the gods. "Well, that settles it," he declares. "The iniquity of my enemies has forced my hand, and that extremely well-timed trumpet solo has sealed my fate. The die is cast." And just like that, boom, he crosses the river, the course of history shifts forever, and we never hear about this random trumpeter again. He simply fades into the mist, having single-handedly nudged one of the most famous men in history into action. He was, in many ways, the ancient world's equivalent of a motivational poster, just blow the trumpet and do it, yet history has given him no credit. No statues. No honorary mentions in textbooks. Just an eternal footnote as the guy who basically decided Rome's fate. But make no mistake, this mystery musician wasn't some accident. No, he was merely another cog in the great historical machine, his entire existence culminating in this one perfect moment of trumpet-blowing destiny. His life chain, just like Caesar's, had led him there. Fate demanded that he be present, armed with brass and impeccable timing. And so he vanished, his work done. Forever relegated to history's backstage, while Caesar gets the standing ovation. But if we've learned anything from this saga, it's that turning points aren't about the big names, they're about all the little weirdos in the background, showing up just in time to play their part. If the stranger hadn't been there. But of course, he was. That trumpet-blowing enigma stood his ground, tooted his fateful tune, and shoved Caesar into immortality. And from that moment, history did what history does best, it spiraled wildly out of control, producing one grand mess after another, each event tripping over itself to set up the next catastrophe. First, the Republic bit the dust. Then, an empire sprouted up like an ambitious weed. That empire, naturally, got too big for its britches and collapsed under the weight of its own bad decisions. Cue Christianity, emerging triumphantly from the rubble, making itself at home, and setting off on a grand world tour. Fast forward a few centuries, boats are crossing oceans, America gets discovered, because obviously, no one was living there before, revolutions pop up like enthusiastic fireworks, and suddenly, the English are pouring into the New World. Naturally, some of these Englishmen decide that the East Coast is too crowded, so they head west, and among them are my ancestors, stubborn pioneers, no doubt, who thought Missouri sounded like a great place to plant their future descendants. And voila! After countless historical dominoes have crashed into each other, here I am. Sitting here, writing about a man with a trumpet who, by some unfathomable cosmic joke, is partly responsible for my very existence. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of this. If that stranger had woken up late that day, missed his Rubicon gig, and gone off to play his trumpet somewhere less historically significant, Caesar might have shrugged, turned around, and gone home. No empire. No fall of said empire. No chain reaction of historical events leading to Missouri and, ultimately, me. Worse yet, in this alternate timeline, I might not even be me, I could be someone entirely different, possibly in an entirely different place, possibly with an entirely different set of circumstances, possibly black? There's truly no telling, but that's the kind of thought that keeps a person up at night. And so, in a turn of events I never expected, I find myself deeply, sincerely, and almost ridiculously grateful to this anonymous trumpeter. I had never given him a second thought before, but now I realize, without him, there is no me. And I, for one, am quite pleased to be here. To me, the most important thing about my life is that I've spent over 40 years getting paid to put words in some kind of entertaining order, a profession as noble as it is baffling. There have been many pivotal moments that nudged me toward this fate, but the last one, the grand finale, gets all the credit simply because it was the final nudge. The other moments, poor things, go largely unnoticed, except, of course, for the crossing of the Rubicon, because history insists on making a big deal out of that one. But when it comes to shaping me into a man of letters, every single link in the chain did its job, and not one of them was more important than another. Yes, even the mighty Rubicon was just another bureaucratic stamp on my inevitable literary passport. And since we're on the subject of fate and the unrelenting domino effect of history, I may as well map out exactly how I ended up in the business of ink and paper. Because I do know how it happened, and if I don't write it down, who will? Certainly not that mysterious trumpet player. That Rubicon business was just one episode in a very long series of questionable life choices leading, ultimately, to me. It wasn't even recent by the time I showed up. If we were being thorough, we'd have to rewind history back to the moment the first fish with a bad attitude dragged itself onto land. But in the interest of time, I'll cut back just a couple of generations and begin with one of my more memorable acts of youthful brilliance. When I was 12 and a half, my father died. A thoroughly unpleasant event, but as it turned out, just the opening act for what was shaping up to be a truly dismal season. That summer, the measles hit town like an over-enthusiastic reaper on a schedule, felling children at a rate that made the whole village collectively reconsider its life choices. Parents went into full panic mode, locking up the survivors as if they were precious artifacts on loan from a very fragile museum. The atmosphere at home was about as cheerful as a haunted house on a budget, whispered prayers, grim faces, a complete ban on fun of any kind. If you so much as chuckled, someone would look at you like you'd just signed your own death warrant. I was one of the imprisoned, pacing my personal purgatory, waiting for the inevitable. Every time I shivered, I was certain the disease had come for me, and after a while, the suspense was worse than the sentence. So I did what any rational 12-year-old would do, I took matters into my own hands. I broke out. Made my way to a friend's house, he had the measles and, more importantly, was in no position to protest. I climbed into bed with him like a deranged scientist conducting a high-stakes experiment. The hypothesis? Then I'd either get it and be done with it or, at the very least, put an end to the torturous waiting. The experiment was a resounding success. His mother caught me mid-contagion theft and promptly ejected me from the premises, but it was too late. The deed was done. Sure enough, I soon found myself at death's door, knocking with enthusiasm. The whole town watched with bated breath, eager for the dramatic conclusion. People checked in on me daily, bracing for bad news, fully convinced I wouldn't make it. Then, on the 14th day, something terrible happened. I didn't die. There was a downturn, a dramatic pause in my decline, and everyone braced for the inevitable tragic finale. But no. I rallied. I got better. And just like that, I had once again disappointed an entire community's expectations. That measles stunt wasn't just a reckless gamble, it was the first domino, the opening note of a long and winding overture. Link number 1, when I recovered, my mother, having reached the end of her patience with my talent for catastrophe, declared my school days officially over. She was done with the exhausting task of keeping me out of trouble and promptly handed me over to a printer, on the reasonable assumption that sterner hands might succeed where hers had failed. And so, I became a printer. With no grand plan, no prophetic sense of direction, I simply moved forward, link by link, on a road that would eventually lead me into the literary world. But at the time, I didn't see it as a road at all, just a job, a way to pass the days. I was indifferent. And, more importantly, content. A young printer does not stay in one place. He wanders, not from restlessness, but because the nature of the work demands it. One job finishes, another must be found. It was during these years that I made the acquaintance of that most relentless and persuasive taskmaster, necessity. Take note, necessity is a circumstance. And circumstance? That is man's true master. A man may think himself free, but when circumstance speaks, he listens. He may argue, but that only gives him the illusion of control, like a stone, mid-fall, trying to negotiate with gravity. In the end, there is no debate. There is only obedience. And so I wandered for 10 years under the firm hand of circumstance, drifting from job to job, town to town, until I arrived in a city in Iowa, where I settled in for several months of steady work. It was during this time that I stumbled across a book about the Amazon. That book was unlike any I had read before. The traveler's account was filled with wild, seductive descriptions of a world so alien and extravagant it might as well have been another planet. He spoke of the great river, stretching endlessly through a land so rich in wonders it seemed wasteful. The birds, the flowers, the creatures, each more fantastic than the last, as if the whole place had been curated by a divine collector of oddities. Alligators and crocodiles lounged like they owned the place, monkeys carried on as if they were running the show, and everything, was alive with some strange, feverish energy. But it was his tale of coca that truly caught my attention. A miraculous plant, he claimed. The natives of the Madeira region needed only a pinch of its powdered leaves to sustain them through a day of endless trekking, uphill, downhill, mile after mile, without hunger, without exhaustion. It sounded impossible. A magic trick. A fantasy disguised as fact. But the traveler swore by it, and I, young, impressionable, and ever willing to believe in the marvelous, was hooked. The Amazon had taken hold of my imagination, and it would not let go. I burned with the desire to ascend that vast, mysterious river, to see for myself the wonders the traveler had described. But it wasn't just curiosity that drove me, I had a grander vision. I would unlock the secrets of coca, bring it to the world, and build a trade so vast it would astonish nations. I dreamed that dream for months, trying in vain to devise a way to reach Para and launch my magnificent enterprise. But planning, as any man with a few years behind him will tell you, is a futile exercise until circumstance takes the matter into its own hands. And so, at last, circumstance intervened. It arranged, for its own purposes, that another man in that town should lose a $50 bill in the street. Then, to further its designs for me, it arranged that I should be the one to find it. Fate is rarely so direct in its generosity, and I recognized the moment for what it was. I placed an advertisement, as honesty required, but I did not wait to see if anyone would claim the money. That same day, I was on my way to the Amazon. Another turning point. Another link in the chain. Now, Had circumstance dropped that same $50 bill at the feet of another man in that town and whispered in his ear, "Go to the Amazon. Build an empire of coca. Change the course of history," would he have obeyed? Certainly not. There were fools aplenty in that town, whole shoals of them, but none cut from my particular cloth. Circumstance is mighty, but it cannot work alone. It needs a partner. That partner is a man's temperament, his natural disposition. A man does not choose his temperament, any more than he chooses the color of his eyes or the shape of his ears. It is stamped upon him at birth, fixed and immovable. He may, under the pressure of some great event, seem to change, but it is an illusion. The moment that pressure lifts, he returns to his true form. Blue eyes may appear gray in certain lights, but let the light shift, and they are blue once more. So it is with temperament. It may be bent, but never broken. It may be disguised, but never altered. It is the one thing about a man that is beyond his own reach. If a man's temperament is not tuned to the pitch of a particular circumstance, that circumstance will pass over him as if it had never existed. A force that might drive one man to the ends of the earth will leave another untouched, unmoved. Had that $50 note found its way to the feet of Caesar, it would not have sent him chasing the Amazon. His nature would have set him on some other path. Perhaps he would have advertised the note and waited, because patience and strategy were bred into his bones. Or perhaps he would have taken the sum to New York and bought into the government, setting in motion a scheme so intricate and so corrupt that when Tweed's turn came, he'd find the field already plowed and planted. So circumstance provided the capital, but it was my temperament that dictated how it would be spent. And temperament, once set, is as fixed as the tide. Sometimes a man's temperament is an ass, and when that is the case, the man is an ass as well, and will remain so. He may, through training, experience, and the right company, acquire the outward trappings of wisdom, even fool people into mistaking him for a mule, steady and reliable. But at his core, he is still an ass, and sooner or later, that truth will surface. Now, my temperament was not the waiting kind. I did things first, and thought about them later. So, without reflection, without hesitation, and without asking a single sensible question, I set off for the Amazon. That was more than 50 years ago. In all that time, my temperament has not changed a shade. I have been punished, punished thoroughly, for my habit of acting first and reflecting afterward. But the pain of those lessons has done me no good. I still obey the orders of circumstance and temperament, and I still reserve my reflection for afterward. When I do reflect, I do it thoroughly, and at a volume that even the deaf could hear. So there I was, stranded in New Orleans, with no ship to Para and no money to find another route. I reflected on my situation until a policeman told me that if I insisted on doing my reflecting in public, he'd see to it that I did my thinking in jail. I took the hint and moved along. Then circumstance stepped in, as it always did, with a new turning point, a fresh link. On my way downriver, I had made the acquaintance of a pilot. Desperate for a way forward, I begged him to teach me the river. He agreed, and just like that, I became a pilot. But circumstance does not let a man stay still for long. Before I could settle into the role, the Civil War arrived, and with it, another upheaval. The boats stopped running, my means of living disappeared, and I found myself once again at a crossroads. As always, circumstance was ready with a new plan. My brother had been appointed secretary of the new territory of Nevada, and he invited me to come along and help in his office. I went. In Nevada, circumstance laid out yet another course for me. This time, it was silver fever. Like every other fool in the territory, I went into the mines, certain I was about to make my fortune. But as ever, what I thought was my purpose was not circumstance's purpose. It was not riches I was being led toward, but something else entirely. For amusement, I began scribbling things for the Virginia City Enterprise. A man doesn't spend 10 years setting type without absorbing something from the pages he prints, good, bad, and otherwise. Without realizing it, he begins to tell the difference, to develop an instinct for what works and what does not. And before he knows it, he has acquired something that passes for a style. One of my pieces caught someone's attention. The Enterprise sent for me and put me on its staff. Another link added to the chain. That was the final link, the great chain completed. But looking back, it's clear that it all started long before that book, before the Quaker City, Before journalism, before piloting, before silver fever. It started in a small Missouri town, where a boy caught the measles and found himself shut up indoors with nothing but books and his own thoughts for company. Had I not been sick, I would have been out in the streets, in the woods, on the river, anywhere but inside, buried in print. But circumstance saw fit to lay me low and push me toward words instead. And once a thing like that takes hold, it does not let go. It plants itself, unnoticed, until the day comes when it stands tall and blocks every other road but its own. Every step since then was just a matter of following where circumstance pointed. If it threw a $50 bill in my path, I picked it up and went to the Amazon. If it took away my job, I found another. If it opened a door, I walked through it, not knowing where it led. And if it put a book in my hand, I read it. I have reflected on these things, against my will, of course, and always after the fact. But I have reflected all the same. And now, after all these years, I know that a man's life is only partly his own. Circumstance does most of the steering, and temperament does most of the pushing. The rest is just the story they make between them, and whether it's a comedy or a tragedy is a thing only they can decide. It's a brilliant answer, really, but it's also a perfect example of how it's not the brilliant man, but the brilliant circumstance that does the heavy lifting. I mean, here's a man who gets credit for all that military genius, but what if it wasn't his genius at all? What if it was just the enemy messing up and giving him a free pass? In fact, I wonder how many so-called brilliant people out there are really just lucky enough to be standing in the right place at the right time, while their circumstances make them look like the mastermind. Take all these generals, politicians, and celebrities, many of them look like they've spent years crafting their personas and plotting their victories. And maybe they have. But I'm willing to bet half the time, it's all circumstance doing the real work, like a puppet master behind the scenes, yanking on the strings just when they're about to fall flat on their faces. And then, when things go wrong, we always hear that the plans were sound because it couldn't possibly be circumstance's fault, could it? No, no, no. It's always someone's poor execution. But the execution was really just circumstance showing up at the wrong moment to throw a wrench in the gears, and all the brilliant plans fell apart like a house of cards. But this is the funny thing about it. It doesn't matter if I acknowledge that circumstance has the reins. People still call it my success, as if I had a hand in it all along. It's almost as though society's in on the joke, giving credit to the planner while circumstance is laughing in the background, high-fiving my temperament, and rolling the dice on the outcome. I'm just along for the ride, folks. And let me tell you, when the ride's good, it's all look at that brilliant guy in charge. And when it's bad, it's how could he have been so clueless? As if I was in charge of anything other than showing up in the right place when the dice landed, not when I wanted them to. And yet, Columbus gets all the credit for discovering America, which is laughable when you think about it. He was aiming for India, for crying out loud. If circumstance had just pointed him left instead of right, he'd still be waiting around somewhere off the coast of Portugal, asking the locals where he could find some spices. Instead, circumstance took a lazy turn and bumped into a whole new continent, and boom, Columbus was hailed as the greatest navigator of all time. What a twist of fate. A guy who thought he was off to find some new trade routes winds up finding an entire continent he didn't even know existed. It's the same with nations. Take the American Revolution, for instance. The founding fathers sat around drafting plans like they were scribbling out a shopping list, thinking they were making all the moves. And sure, they had a hand in it, but as soon as circumstance showed up, hello, France and all that, things took off in a direction none of them had ever anticipated. There was no plan for the French helping out, but circumstance knew what was up and threw that card into the mix. Suddenly, instead of just a few tea-soaked patriots getting mad about taxes, we had a full-blown revolution on our hands, and the next thing you know, we've got a whole new country and a bunch of people giving speeches about liberty. It's a funny thing about history, really. People talk about plans like they were the cause of everything, but honestly, the plan's not even the star of the show. Circumstance is the one in the spotlight, doing all the heavy lifting while everyone else claps and calls it strategy. Poor Columbus, poor revolutionaries, they didn't sign up for this kind of fame. They just showed up, did their thing, and let circumstance take care of the rest. And now, here they are, forever immortalized for being in the right place at the right time, with a little help from fate. And yet, when you really think about it, How could Adam and Eve have resisted? It was their temperament that dictated everything. They were born with a natural affinity for the apple, their hands practically aching to grab it. God knew that, and yet He went ahead and made the command anyway, as though mere words could override what was baked into their very being. It's as if He gave them a map to the treasure, told them not to touch it, and then handed them a treasure chest with a "Do Not Open" sign stuck right on the lid. How could anyone be expected to resist that? Certainly not Adam, with his butter-like temperament. If only they had been wired differently, like Martin Luther or Joan of Arc, with temperaments forged in the fires of adversity, made of something tougher, something more fireproof. Can you imagine how different things would have been? Instead of a garden full of temptation, you would have had two stubborn souls who'd have told the serpent to go pound sand. Instead of humanity falling headlong into sin, we'd be witnessing a righteous rebellion that would have kept the apple tree untouched for centuries. The serpent? Probably end up in a snit, hissing and wondering what went wrong. That, I would have liked to see. But no, instead we got Adam, who, in his infinite weakness, heard a whisper and couldn't help but take a bite. And Eve, with her own charmingly impressionable temperament, did the same. They were swept away, not by their own wills, but by the nature that they couldn't control. What a classic case of bad wiring. It's almost as if their temperaments were designed for failure. And here we are, paying the price. If it weren't for that original bite, I wouldn't be here reflecting on it in the first place, writing about things I didn't plan to write about and creating links I didn't choose. Perhaps if those two had just held off on the fruit, we'd have all avoided this literary conundrum, but it's too late now. The chain is forged, and here I am, following the links all the way to a career I didn't exactly plan.